Schools of thought in macroeconomics. We have the classical school, the Keynesian school, and the monetarist schools of thought. I've previously sent you pictures of graphs in terms of aggregate demand, aggregate supply for each of these models. In addition, we spoke extensively in class about the Keynesian versus the classical model. But to recapitulate each briefly in words, refer back to your graphs. Okay. Classical model. Aggregate supply curve in the short run is vertical, just like it is in the long run. Okay. So that sets up a scenario that regardless of any change in aggregate demand, the real GDP is completely determined by aggregate supply. Aggregate demand can shift to and fro, but all it changes is the price level. It doesn't change real GDP because the aggregate supply curve is short run, is vertical even in the short run. Okay? So aggregate demand is negatively sloped in the classical model, just as it is in all the models. There's only one variable, though, that shifts the aggregate demand curve, and that one variable is money. So on the graph, I have it represented by a big M inside of the parentheses, indicating that money is the sole shift parameter in the classical model. An increase in money shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right. That raises the price level, but since the aggregate supply curve is vertical, it doesn't affect real GDP. If money supply decreases, well, then the aggregate demand curve shifts to the left, and that causes the price level to decline. But once again, real GDP is not impacted since the aggregate supply curve is vertical. Okay? So that's the essence of the classical model. Okay? Keynesian model, the aggregate supply curve probably has positive slope. In certain situations, it's even horizontal under conditions of chronic mass unemployment. Okay? But more often than not, it's going to have a positive slope. Okay? So aggregate supply is positively sloped. Keynesian model. Aggregate demand is affected by many variables, including money. Okay? But in addition to money, in the Keynesian model, aggregate demand is impacted by autonomous consumption, autonomous investment, government spending, taxes, okay, exports and imports. So you have all these variables that have the potential to shift aggregate demand. And when aggregate demand shifts in the Keynesian model, the price level isn't the only thing that can potentially change. Also, real GDP changes. So here are the variables that shift the aggregate demand curve to the right in the Keynesian model. They would include autonomous consumption. Increase in autonomous consumption shifts aggregate demand to the right and increases real GDP. An increase in autonomous investment shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right, as does an increase in government spending or an increase in exports. Okay? A decrease in taxes in a lump sum sense, okay, a decrease in taxes would shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. as would a decrease in imports. That shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right, raises the level of real GDP, since the aggregate supply curve is at least positively sloped. So that's the essence of the classical and Keynesian model. That's a brief little recapitulation. Monetarists agree with the Keynesians that in the short run, aggregate supply curve is positively sloped, although monetarists emphasize the long run, vertical, okay, not so much the short run, okay. So aggregate supply curve in the short run is positively sloped for monetarists. They agree with the Keynesians there, although they do not put the emphasis on the short run the way the Keynesians do. Okay. Aggregate demand. What are the variables that shift the aggregate demand curve for monetarists? Well, monetarism has something to do with money, so the big thing for monetarists is money. They agree with the Keynesians that, hey, government spending, taxes, autonomous consumption, autonomous investment, and net exports, all of that affects aggregate demand curve too, but insignificantly. For the monetarists, money is the only variable that significantly shifts the aggregate demand curve. So on one level, they kind of agree with Keynesians, hey, all these variables affect aggregate demand, but because money is the only thing that affects the aggregate demand curve significantly, well, then money's the only thing you really have to pay any significant attention to. And this leads the monetarists to adopt what's known as a fixed rate of growth rule for the money supply. They think that all would be well with the economy if the Federal Reserve just adopted a fixed rate of growth rule for the money supply, because it's changes in the money supply that the Fed can control that causes the ups and downs of the economy. So if the Fed would stop using discretionary monetary policy and just have a fixed rate of growth rule, then the ups and downs of the macroeconomy in terms of the business cycle would be very modest, very, acceptable. Okay? And since fiscal policy can affect the economy significantly, they would advocate, hey, just, follow a balanced budget as much as possible. So those are three schools of thought, okay? The classical, the Keynesian, and the monetarist. But in addition today, I wanted to take a look in graphical terms at two additional schools of thought. And let me bring this closer to you. Over here we have the model known as rational expectations, and over here we have the model known as supply side. So let's start with rational expectations, also known as the new classical model. What shifts the aggregate demand curve for rational expectations? Well, the school of thought as a whole doesn't really make any pronouncement on that. Now, I'm not saying that an individual rational expectations economist doesn't have any point of view as to what shifts the aggregate demand curve, but one can be a rational expectations economist and have a variety of points of view about what shifts the aggregate demand curve. In other words, a rational expectations economist could essentially agree with the classical view there, the Keynesian view, or the monetarist view. Now, on the whole, they tend more to agree with the monetarist view than anything else. But we're going to put a question mark there by variables that affect aggregate demand. Okay? Aggregate supply is vertical in the short run for rational expectations economists on average. Okay? So for rational expectations, unlike the classical, workers don't know the real wage. They form expectations about the real wage. On average, their expectations are correct. And so on average, the aggregate supply curve is vertical. So that dashed line represents where the aggregate supply curve is on average for the rational expectations economist. Okay? And you're going to be there when the typical worker expects the price level to be what it actually is. In other words, they guess correctly. But we're going to be off on this side, okay? In other words, the supply of goods and services is going to be greater than where it is on average, okay? If the expected price level is less than the actual price level. In other words, workers underestimate what the true price level is. And then you're going to be on this side over here when the expected price level is greater than the actual price level. So that's the essence of rational expectations. It's all about aggregate supply being not vertical always, but vertical on average. So when GDP is above this level over here, it's because workers are fooling themselves into working more hours than what they would if they really understood what the price level was. And over here on this side, workers are fooling themselves into working fewer hours than what they would like to work if they really understood where the price level was. So over here, they're overestimating the price level, and over here, they're underestimating the price level. And when workers guess correctly, which they do on average, well, then GDP is right here. We follow that little dashed line. What this means for policy is if the government tries to affect the aggregate demand curve by changing government spending or changing money, whatever would affect the aggregate demand curve in the true model of the economy, the typical worker, typical economic agent for rational expectations economists, knows what shifts the aggregate demand curve in the true model of the economy. And on average, they anticipate correctly the impact on the price level, and then any anticipated increase in aggregate demand, a shift to the right, on average won't affect the level of real GDP because workers guess the impact correctly. Okay? So that's the essence of rational expectations. Now, over here, I have depicted the supply side view. Okay? Like the rational expectations model, the supply side model doesn't form any all-inclusive point of view as to what shifts aggregate demand. Again, this doesn't mean the individual supply side economist doesn't have a point of view there, but the school of thought, the model as a whole, doesn't have anything definitive to say about what shifts aggregate demand. They also don't have anything as a school of thought definitive about what to say concerning the slope of the aggregate supply curve. Could be vertical in the short run, it could be positively sloped in the short run. That's not where their focus is. It's not on the slope of the aggregate supply curve. It's on what shifts the aggregate supply curve. And for supply-siders, a reduction in tax rates or a reduction in government regulation, particularly types of government regulation they tend to not like environmental protection measures, civil rights protection measures, consumer product and health and safety regulations, as well as worker safety regulations. All forms of government regulation, if you cut them, well, that would increase aggregate supply shifted to the right in their view. And when government regulation or tax rates increase, well, then in their view, that shifts aggregate supply to the left. So in the supply-siders, also known as Reaganomics, that's when it really got started with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, although its ascendancy in certain circles occurred before that time. A few prominent names there for among supply-siders would be Jack Kemp as well as George Gilder. It's really all about that focus on tax rates and regulation. So if the aggregate supply curve shifts to the right, if you reduce tax rates and reduce government regulation, well, then that expands the GDP. It also serves to push down the price level and, fight inflation. So you can fight inflation and fight unemployment both at the same time by reducing tax rates and reducing government regulation, according to the supply-siders. Now, there's a lot of critics of supply-side economics. It's not generally well regarded among macroeconomists as a whole. Okay, so highly controversial ideas. First, on the government regulation. Any type of government regulation in terms of protecting the environment or protecting civil rights, one could also make the argument that, hey, those things have a positive impact upon aggregate supply and would shift it to the right, exactly contrary to what the supply-siders are arguing. Government regulations, laws that protect consumer product safety, protect the environment, protect worker safety and worker health, civil rights, okay? All these things can actually enhance productivity by positively impacting social cohesion, positively impacting the health of people, living in a healthy environment. That's a good thing. It actually stimulates productivity, shifting aggregate supply to the right. Healthier people living a healthier environment become more productive. Okay, so highly controversial there, and even their arguments as to the positive impacts of decreasing tax rates on aggregate supply are controversial at best. And I gave you some of the reasons for those criticisms in the notes provided. You also have further discussion in the book, in your text by Freund. But aggregate demand, aggregate supply is the framework on which to do an analysis of the different points of view in regard to various types of government policy, fiscal and monetary, that impact the macroeconomy. So that's one of your questions on the final, and I hope this little video, along with your notes and along with your text, assists you in answering that question. If you have any specific questions, don't hesitate to email me. Anyway, I hope this video is helpful to you.